The morning after her father was buried, the solicitor laid a single sheet of paper on the writing table and told Eleanor Wycliffe she had until the candles guttered to sign it. The library at Harrogate smelled of cold ash and lamp oil, and the November light through the tall windows was the gray of slate left out in rain. She stood at the head of the table in the black gown that had been re-dyed twice, and she looked at the paper, and she did not pick up the pen. 3 gentlemen waited for her to be sensible. To the men gathered in that room, she was already a problem solved, a signature pending, a young woman of 24 who had outlived her usefulness the moment her father's heart had stopped. What none of them yet understood was that her father had taught her the one thing the law could not take, and that the document before her was built on a lie. She alone could see the man who had brought the paper was Mr. Alley Pinch, her late father's man of business, and beside him sat her cousin Crispin, who had inherited the title and the entailed lands, and believed, with the easy confidence of a man who had never been refused, that he had also inherited her. Stay with me through this one, because the quiet woman they had decided to overlook is about to become the only person in the county they cannot manage. The third man stood apart at the terrace door, and she did not yet know his name. The paper would have surrendered her marriage portion, £3,000 settled on her by her dead mother, into Crispin's keeping until such time as he judged her fit to receive it. It was dressed as protection. A woman alone could not be trusted with money, the reasoning ran, and a grieving woman least of all, and so the sum would be held in trust by the cousin who had arrived at the funeral in new boots and an old grievance. Eleanor read the sheet twice. She found the clause that named her father as the settler and the date of the settlement, and she set one gloved finger beneath the date, and she said, in a voice that did not shake, that the settlement had been made in the year of her mother's death, and that the man who had drawn it could not have drawn it, because he had not yet been admitted to the profession in that year. The room went still. Mr. Pinch's mouth opened and closed. Crispin laughed, the short bark of a man who expects laughter to settle a matter, and he told her she was overwrought, that grief had made her fanciful, that the paper was sound and she would sign it, and be grateful. She did not sign it. She folded her hands and waited, and the silence stretched until it was the loudest thing in the library. And into that silence the man at the terrace door turned and looked at her for the first time, and something in his face changed and did not change back. His name was Gideon Hartfield, the Duke of Ravensmere, and he had come to Harrogate on a matter of land that bordered her father's and had nothing to do with her at all. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, with dark hair gone iron at the temples, and a jaw that held itself like carved stone. The county knew 3 things about him, and was wrong about 2 of them. It knew he was rich, which was true. It knew he was cold, which was the surface of a thing and not the thing. And it knew that his young wife had died 4 winters past, and that he had not danced, dined, or courted since, which the county read as pride, and which was, in fact, a grief he carried, folded in his breast pocket, where another man might carry a watch. He had meant to conclude his business and leave before the funeral guests dispersed. He stayed because a woman in a twice-dyed gown had just caught 3 men in a forgery using nothing but a date, and the steadiness of her own voice. She did not see him watching. That was the first of many things she did not see, and you, listening, will see them all before she does. Gideon crossed the library without hurry and asked, with the level courtesy of a man accustomed to being answered, whether he might examine the settlement. Mr. Blond Pinch, who knew exactly who the Duke was, and exactly what a Duke's interest in a private matter could mean, surrendered the paper as though it had grown hot. Gideon read it once. He held it to the window. He looked at the watermark in the laid paper, and at the date, and at the signature that purported to belong to a solicitor who had been a boy of 19 at the time, and he set the sheet down on the table with a care that was somehow worse than violence. He said only that Miss Wycliffe appeared to him entirely in possession of her faculties, and that he would advise no one in the room to press her further. On the strength of a document he would not himself sign. Then he inclined his head to Eleanor as though she were the highest-ranking person present, And he took his leave, and the matter that had been settled in every mind but hers was suddenly settled in none. What she felt as he left was not gratitude. Gratitude was a coin she had stopped spending. What she felt was a strange, unwelcome warmth at the back of her neck. An awareness of exactly where in the room he had stood even after the door had closed behind him, and she disliked it intensely, because warmth was a thing she could not afford and a thing that had never once been safe. Harrogate had been her whole world, and now it belonged to Crispin. The house, the home farm, the long beach avenue her father had planted the year she was born, the library where she had learned her letters at his knee, the very bed she slept in, all of it passed by the entail to a cousin who had visited twice in her lifetime and disliked it both times. She was permitted to remain until the spring, as a courtesy that everyone understood to be a leash. Her mother's £3,000 was the only thing in the world that was hers, and it was the only thing standing between her and a future as some distant relation's unpaid companion, and Crispin wanted it, and the document had been his means of taking it, and she had refused to sign. Her father had been a quiet scholar of a man who cared more for his books and his bridge accounts than for the marriage market, and he had done one practical thing in his impractical life. He had taught his only daughter to read a legal instrument the way other young ladies were taught to read music. She knew the difference between a settlement and a deed, between an executor and a trustee, between a clause that protected a woman and a clause that merely appeared to. It was an unfashionable education, and it had made her unmarriageable in the eyes of every matchmaking mother in 3 parishes, and it had just saved her £3,000, and she would not have traded it for all the accomplishments in the world. In the days that followed, Crispin's confidence did not so much crack as recalibrate. He had expected to manage a grieving girl and had instead met a woman who could cite him the year of the married women's property customs and the limits of a trustee's discretion, and so he changed his approach. He grew warm. He grew familiar. At dinner he spoke of how natural it would be, how tidy, how exactly the sort of arrangement that kept property and person within a family if she were simply to marry him. Then the £3,000 would be his by law, and there would be no document to forge, and she could keep her precious Harrogate, and everyone would call it a love match and a kindness. She refused that too. She refused it across the soup, and she refused it across the fish, and when he pressed her in the corridor afterward, his hand closing on her wrist, with the casual certainty of a man who had never had a no mean no, she removed his hand and told him she would rather scrub floors in a stranger's house than be mistress of her own under his name. He told her, with the smile still on his face, that floors could be arranged. The dismissive label arrived in the mouth of Crispin's mother, the Dowager Lady Wycliffe, who came up from Bath to see the matter properly closed. She found Eleanor in the morning room mending a hem, and she settled herself with her fan held at a measured height, and she observed to the air as though Eleanor were furniture, that it was a great pity, but the girl had clearly inherited her father's oddness, and that an unnatural woman who read law and refused her own salvation could expect nothing better than to die a poor relation in a back bedroom. An unnatural woman. The Dowager said it lightly, the way one names a flaw in a horse. And Eleanor kept her needle moving and did not look up, and only the small white knuckles of her left hand betrayed that the words had found their mark. Gideon did not leave the county. His land business at the bordering estate of Coldstream gave him reason to remain, and he found, over the weeks that followed, that the reason multiplied. He called at Harrogate ostensibly to consult the late Mr. Wycliffe's maps of the disputed boundary, and he was shown into the library, and Eleanor was sent for because she alone knew where the maps were kept. She spread them on the long table and traced the old stream line with one gloved finger, and he stood closer than the maps required. And he asked her a question about the watercourse that he had no practical need to ask, simply to hear her answer it. She answered it. Precisely. He listened as though precision were a rare music. She did not notice that he had stopped looking at the map. She did not notice either the way his gaze moved from the map to her hands, and stayed there. The cracked knuckles of a woman who did her own mending in cold rooms, and she would have been astonished to learn that the Duke found those hands more worth looking at than any pair of soft white ones in the county. He took his leave that day, with the boundary still undecided, and made no appointment to settle it, and he came again the following week, with the same thin pretext, and the week after that, and the servants at Harrogate began to set out the good port without being asked. Once, reaching past her for a rolled chart, his sleeve brushed the bare skin above her glove, and she felt the contact travel the length of her arm like cold water, and she stepped back too quickly and knocked a candlestick, and he steadied it without remark and without stepping back himself, and for the space of 3 heartbeats neither of them moved, and the only sound in the library was the fire and her own pulse loud in her ears. What he noticed, what the whole slow autumn taught him to notice, was that she was never idle and never asked for thanks. He saw her carry broth to the gardener's wife who had taken a fever, climbing the cold back stairs herself rather than ringing for a maid who had enough to do. He saw her stop in the stable yard to free a tangle of harness from the leg of a frightened pony, speaking to the animal in a low, even voice until it stood quiet. None of it was performed. None of it was for him or for anyone watching, because she did not know that anyone was watching. And that was precisely what made it true. The witnessing scene came on a raw afternoon in the village. Gideon had ridden in to see his own solicitor, and was crossing the square when he saw, through the rain-streaked window of the chandler's shop, Eleanor, standing at the counter with a child's hand in hers. The child was the orphaned daughter of a tenant, lately dead of the same fever, a thin, small girl of perhaps 7, named Bess, and the shopman was refusing the child. The half-pound of candles her grandmother had sent her for because the family's account was 3 weeks in arrears and the grandmother could not pay. Eleanor did not lecture the shopman, and did not make a scene. She drew out her own small purse, the purse of a woman with £3,000 she could not touch, and almost nothing she could, and she paid the arrears in full and bought the candles and a quarter of tea besides, and she knelt down to the child's height and tucked the parcel into the small, cold hands and told her to mind the puddles going home. Then she straightened, and she saw the Duke at the window, and the color came up in her face, and she lifted her chin as though daring him to make it charity. He did not make it charity. He came in out of the rain, the bell over the door jangling, and he bought nothing, and he said nothing about what he had seen. He only walked her and the child back through the wet street to the corner, where Bess's grandmother waited, his great height shielding them from the worst of the weather without his ever seeming to arrange it. And at the corner, he said, in the level voice that gave nothing away, that she should not stand about in the rain, that she would take a chill, and that she was to go home and sit by a fire. "Come inside," he had said, in effect. "Sit down, get warm." She heard a command and bristled at it. The audience heard a man who did not know how to say that he was afraid for her, and so said the only thing he knew how to say, which was an order. That night, by her own small fire, Eleanor turned the afternoon over in her mind, and could not make it lie flat. She told herself the Duke's attentions were idle, the passing notice a great man pays to a curiosity, and that to read anything else into them was exactly the fanciful weakness Crispin accused her of. Her mind said one thing. Her hands, when she remembered the weight of his coat sleeve brushing her shoulder in the rain, said another, folding and unfolding the same square of linen until the creases would not come out. The wound he carried came out into the light by accident on a gray morning in the Coldstream Gallery, where she had gone to return a borrowed map. She thought the house empty. She found the Duke standing before a portrait, turned to face the wall. A tall canvas he had reversed, so that only its gray backing showed, and when he heard her step he did not pretend. He told her in a low and level voice that the painting was of his wife Cecily. Dead 4 winters of a fever he had been too proud to believe dangerous until it was too late to send to London for the better physician. He had judged the country doctor sufficient. He had been wrong, and a woman of 23 had died of his certainty, and he had turned her portrait to the wall because he could not bear her painted eyes to watch him go on living. He said it once. He did not say it again. He drew from his breast pocket, where she had once seen his hand stray without knowing why, a small folded paper worn soft as cloth at the creases, the last note his wife had written him, and he held it a moment and put it away. Eleanor understood then that the coldness the county prized him for was not the absence of feeling. It was a man standing very still so that the grief would not spill. She crossed the gallery to stand beside him, not too near, and she looked at the gray back of the canvas with him, and she let the silence be a thing they held together rather than a thing she rushed to fill. He told her, because she did not press him, the rest of it in pieces. That Cecily had been gentle and easily frightened, and had asked him in her last clear hour to look after the boy Thomas, her sister's orphaned son, and that he had promised, and had then found he could not keep the promise in any way that mattered, because the child had her chin and her way of tilting his head, and every glance at him reopened the wound. That he had built his whole life since around not looking, the portrait to the wall, the boy to the servants, the county kept at the length of his cold, correct manners, all of it a careful architecture of not looking, and that he was tired in a way that sleep did not mend. She did not tell him he was wrong to grieve. She did not offer him comfort, because she of all people knew that comfort offered too soon is only another kind of pressure. She said, instead, that the country doctor had attended her own father, and that there were illnesses no physician in London could have turned, and that a man could be wrong without being to blame. It was not absolution. It was the truth, offered plainly, and he received it as though no one had spoken plainly to him in 4 years. He looked at her then, fully, the way he had looked at the forged settlement against the window, as though reading her for the truth of her, and she felt the look land somewhere beneath her ribs and stay. He did not reach for her. His hand lifted from his side a bare inch and stopped. The gesture of a man who has just remembered the cost of touching what one cannot keep, and he let it fall again, and the not touching was louder in that gray gallery than any embrace would have been. Something between them had shifted and would not shift back. If this is the kind of story you keep close on a long evening, you already know the turn is coming, and it is nearly here. The dowager saw the shift before either of them named it, and she moved to close the door she felt opening. She had come north to settle Eleanor into poverty, and instead found a duke calling at a tenant house twice a week, and a duke's interest, even unspoken, could undo every arrangement she had built. She summoned to Harrogate a young woman named Lady Penelope Frith, the polished daughter of a viscount, gold-haired and accomplished and entirely without unfashionable opinions, and she installed her as the obvious and correct object of any duke's attention. And she let it be known about the county that an understanding between Ravensmere and the Frith family was as good as settled. At the assembly held in the Coldstream ballroom that the duke could not, as the district's first gentleman, decline to host, the dowager arranged Lady Penelope at his right hand and Eleanor at the farthest cold edge of the room, near the doors where the draught came in her twice-dyed gown among the silks and the diamonds. It was in that ballroom, beneath the blazing candles, that the dowager voiced the label for the second time, and louder. She said to a knot of listening matrons in a carrying voice pitched precisely to reach the doors, that it was a charity to invite the Wycliffe girl at all, that an unnatural woman who had refused every reasonable provision made for her could hardly complain if society returned the refusal, and that Lady Penelope, now, there was a young woman who understood what was owed to a great name. The matrons tittered, heads turned toward the cold edge of the room. Eleanor stood very straight under the weight of it, and her face stayed still, but her pulse beat so hard in her throat that she was certain the woman beside her must hear it. Across the room Gideon heard the carrying voice, and the audience could see what the dowager could not, which was the exact moment his courtesy turned to something with an edge. He did not cross the room. Not yet. He bowed over Lady Penelope's hand with perfect correctness, and answered the dowager with perfect coldness, and he watched, all evening, the woman at the cold edge of the room who never once asked anyone to look at her. He noticed that Eleanor slipped away early, before the dancing was fully underway, and he noticed where she went, which was not to her carriage, but to the gallery off the ballroom where a child's voice could be heard, his own ward, as it happened, a small boy named Thomas, his late wife's nephew. Given into his keeping and largely raised by servants because the Duke could not look at the boy without seeing Cecily's chin. Eleanor had heard the child crying past his bedtime, overlooked in the bustle of the great party, and she had gone to him. And Gideon, following, stopped in the doorway and was not seen. She was sitting on the floor in her ruined gown, with the boy in her lap, and she was telling him, not a fairy story, but the true names of the constellations through the gallery window, Orion and his belt and the cold, bright dog star at his heel, and the boy had stopped crying to listen. Gideon stood in the dark of the doorway and watched the one woman in 3 parishes who had reason to despise the great and the comfortable sit on a cold floor to comfort a child who was nothing to her, and he understood that he had stopped, some weeks ago, being able to imagine the rest of his life without her in it. He did not announce himself. He withdrew before she knew he was there, and he carried the image out of the ballroom and home through the dark, and it did not leave him. The dark moment came fast. After that, the way the Dowager had designed it to. Lady Wycliffe understood that her arranged understanding with the Friths would mean nothing if the Duke's heart was elsewhere, and so she resolved to make Eleanor's position untenable before spring, to drive her out of the county and out of the Duke's sight entirely. She found her lever in the forged settlement Eleanor had refused to sign. The Dowager went to Crispin and pointed out that the girl's refusal had left the £3,000 technically unsettled and the household accounts technically unaudited, and that a clever solicitor, properly instructed, might construe Eleanor's careful management of her father's last accounts as something less innocent. A whisper began. It said that the odd Wycliffe girl who knew so very much about money and documents had perhaps known too much, that funds had perhaps gone astray in the confusion of the old man's dying, that her refusal to sign was perhaps not principle, but the cunning of a thief covering her tracks. The whisper reached the Duke, as the Dowager intended, carried to Coldstream by a dinner guest who relished the telling, and it reached Eleanor, as the Dowager also intended, in its cruelest form. Crispin came to her in the library, the Dowager at his shoulder, and he laid out the choice with the smiling certainty she had come to dread. She would marry him within the month, and the question of the accounts would never be raised, or she would refuse him a final time and find herself accused before the magistrate of robbing her own dead father, with her unnatural cleverness about ledgers offered as the proof of it. The Dowager voiced the label for the 3rd time, then in the witnessed privacy of that room, leaning close to say that an unnatural woman who had set herself above her sex would find that the law she loved so well had teeth, and that those teeth were about to close. It was the last and the most deliberate voicing, and it was meant to break her. It did not break her, but it grieved her past anything the funeral had done, because for the first time she understood that there was no document she could read her way out of. No clause to cite, no date to catch. They had stopped fighting her with paper and started fighting her with her own good name, and a good name was the one possession a woman of 24 could not get back once it was taken. She sat alone in the library that night among her father's books, and let herself for 1 hour feel the full, cold weight of it. The fire burned low, and she did not ring for more coal. She thought of the Duke, and of the inch his hand had lifted and fallen in the grey gallery, and she told herself that whatever had moved between them counted for nothing now, that a man with a name and a portrait to protect could not afford a wife accused of theft, and that she had been a fool to let the warmth at the back of her neck mean anything at all. Then she dried her face on the back of her wrist, because she had taught herself young that tears were a thing one did privately and briefly, and she did the thing her father had taught her, which was not to despair and not to flee, but to gather the evidence. She lit a fresh candle and went to the strong-box. She unlocked the estate strong-box to which she, still by oversight, held the key, and she drew out the true settlement, her mother's real settlement, correctly dated and correctly witnessed, that she had found among her father's papers in the first numb week after the funeral, and told no one because she had not until that night understood she would need to prove not only that the forged paper was false, but that she herself was honest. She laid the true paper on the table, and beside it she set out the household account books in her own neat hand. Every entry dated, every shilling traced, the careful record of a woman who had managed a dying man's affairs with scrupulous honesty precisely because she had known the world would one day look for a reason to doubt her. She worked until the candle was a stub. She found the witness named on the true settlement, an old clerk still living in the parish, and she noted his direction. She found the watermark in the laid paper, and held it to the light to be certain of the year. By the time the church clock struck 2, she had assembled, page by page, the quiet, unanswerable case for her own honesty. And she banked what was left of the fire and went up to bed, and she slept the deep sleep of a woman who has stopped being afraid and started being ready. She did not flee in the night, though Crispin had as good as dared her to. She had nowhere to flee to, and more than that, flight would have looked exactly like guilt, and she would not gift them that. She sent instead, by the carrier at first light, a single letter to the one person in the county whose word the magistrate could not ignore, and whose interest in her she had spent all autumn refusing to believe in. She did not ask the Duke to save her. She asked him only to come and to bring his own man of business, and to read 2 documents side by side, and to judge for himself which hand had written the truth. It was the letter of a woman who trusted evidence more than rescue, and it was, though she did not frame it so, the most intimate thing she had ever asked of anyone. He came within the hour. He brought his solicitor, and he brought the senior magistrate of the district, an old peer named Lord Aldous, who had sat on the bench for 30 years and owed the Duke nothing, but owed the law everything. And Gideon did a thing that startled even Eleanor, who thought by then she had taken his measure. He did not take her aside to settle the matter quietly and spare everyone embarrassment, which a kind man might have done and which would have left the whisper alive to grow again in the dark. He asked that the matter be heard where it had been made, in the Coldstream ballroom before the same county that had stood at the cold edge of the room and tittered. He sent his cards out that very afternoon. He gave the gathered hierarchy no choice but to assemble and to watch. They assembled beneath the same blazing candles. The dowager came in her diamonds, certain of her ground, with Lady Penelope on one side and Crispin on the other, and the whisper already doing its work in every corner of the room. Eleanor came last, in the twice-dyed gown, with no ally visible but the small folded documents in her reticule and the steadiness her father had left her in place of money. The Duke's solicitor laid the 2 settlements side by side on the long table, the forged one Crispin's faction had produced, and the true one Eleanor had kept, and he read aloud the date of each, and the name of the solicitor on each, and the simple unanswerable fact that the man named on the forged paper had been a boy of 19, not yet admitted to practice. In the year it claimed to have been signed, the room understood it in stages, the way a tide turns, first at the edges, and then all at once. Crispin's face went the color of tallow. The dowager rose, and her voice, which had been an instrument of such precision all autumn, fragmented for the first time, insisting that there had been some confusion, some error of dates, that the girl had surely done something, that an unnatural woman who knew so much about documents had surely forged the second to discredit the first. Lord Aldous asked her, with the terrible mildness of the very old, whether she meant to accuse Miss Wycliffe of forging a paper that bore a watermark from the correct year, and a witness still living in the parish who might be sent for within the hour. The dowager had no answer. She opened her fan and closed it and opened it again, and the matrons who had tittered in that very room now studied the floor. Into the silence that the evidence had built, Gideon crossed the ballroom. He crossed it without hurry, in 3 unhurried strides, that the whole room watched, and he stopped before Eleanor at the cold edge where the draught came in. And he took her gloved hand in his, and in front of the dowager and the rival and the claimant and the assembled county that had decided months ago not to see her, quote, he said the thing he had crossed the room to say. He said, his voice level and carrying to every corner, that he would marry Miss Wycliffe, and that no one would speak against her again. The silence after the line held for the length of a held breath, and in that silence The meaning of it traveled to every face in the room. Lady Penelope, to her lasting credit, was the first to understand fully, and she inclined her head to Eleanor with a small, rueful courtesy that said she had never wanted to be a weapon and was glad to be set down. Crispin made one strangled sound of protest, and found Lord Aldous' cold eye upon him, and thought better of it. The dowager sat down very suddenly, as though her strings had been cut, and she did not rise again that evening, and the diamonds at her throat caught the candlelight and meant nothing at all. The crowd, the same crowd, turned toward Eleanor, and one by one the faces that had looked away in this room learned to look at her, and the looking was the reversal made visible. Eleanor stood at the center of the suddenly attentive room, with her hand in the Duke's, and she did not gloat, and she did not weep, and she did not say a clever thing, because for once in her careful life there was nothing she needed to prove. She had not been rescued. She had gathered the evidence, and kept the true paper, and refused, through one long, cold autumn, to sign the lie, or marry the liar, or run from the accusation. And the Duke had not saved her so much as crossed the room to stand publicly. The distinction mattered to her more than the marriage did, and she thought he understood that, and when she looked up at his face, she found that he did. Lord Aldous made the ruling that sealed it past any undoing, declaring the forged settlement void, the accounts against Miss Wycliffe dismissed as malicious, and the true settlement of £3,000 confirmed as hers and hers alone, to bring to her marriage or to keep apart from it as she herself should choose. He looked at the Duke when he said the last part, and the Duke inclined his head, and the procedural door closed and could not be reopened. The hierarchy had spoken in the very room where it had condemned her, and it had reversed itself, and the dowager's diamonds and the claimant's smile and the whole machinery of the season had been turned aside not by a louder cruelty, but by a quieter truth. They were married in the spring in the small grey church at Coldstream rather than the great one in town, with the beech avenue at Harrogate just coming into leaf and Lord Aldous standing as a witness, and the boy Thomas scrubbed and solemn holding the ring. Eleanor did not bring her £3,000 to the marriage. She kept it apart, as Lord Aldous had ruled she might, not because she doubted her husband, but because a woman who has once stood at the cold edge of a room never again gives away the one thing that is wholly her own, and Gideon, who understood her better than anyone living, never once asked her to. The following winter, snow fell on the long windows of the Coldstream Gallery, and a fire burned in the grate, and the portrait of Cecily Hartfield hung once more facing the room, restored to the wall by the man who could at last bear her painted gaze. Eleanor sat near the fire with her mending, because old habits do not die merely because circumstances improve. And across the gallery the boy Thomas lay on the hearthrug, naming the constellations to a kitten, Orion, and the cold bright dog star, in the words she had taught him on the night of the assembly. Gideon stood at the window, watching the snow come down over the land that bordered Harrogate, the land he had first come north to dispute, and had ended by joining to his own through the one bond no entail could touch. On the small table at Eleanor's elbow lay the worn, soft paper she had once seen him draw from his breast pocket, his wife's last note, no longer hidden now, but kept where the living could see it, because grief honored in the open weighs less than grief carried folded against the heart. Beside it lay her father's spectacles, which she had saved from the wreck of Harrogate and could not part with, the spectacles through which a quiet scholar had taught his daughter to read the truth of a document, and, without ever meaning to, taught her to read the truth of a man. She picked them up and folded the worn arms, closed and held them a moment in the firelight, and the snow kept falling, and the boy named the stars, and the house was warm. She had been a problem to be solved, a signature pending, an unnatural woman at the cold edge of the room. She was none of those things now. She was simply home. If Eleanor's long, cold autumn stayed with you, stay a moment longer in the warmth of that gallery before you go, and if it moved you, leave a word about the moment you felt the room turn. Thank you for staying to the end of the snow.